Peter, you were a Typhoon fighter pilot in the Second World War. Can you tell us about the armaments on the Typhoon?
The rocket projectiles?
Yes.
In 1943, the aircraft were taken away from us and we had to use substitute aircraft from another squadron while they fitted them with rocket rails. These were, under each wing they put 4 assemblies of double tubes, which meant that they had 4 long runs where you could load rockets on, and when you fired the rocket it flew off the end of the 4-foot thing and was then accelerated away. The rockets themselves didn't have any name, they were just called RPs, rocket projectiles, and they consisted basically of 3 items: the rocket motor, which was a tube about 4 foot long and about 4 inches diameter. At the back end it had 4 fins, which were packed separately and then were slotted into preformed slots on the back of the rear end of the tube. And then the warhead was mounted at the front end. The warhead consisted of 4 different types. Mainly it was the 60-pound high explosive, and then there was I think it was 40-pound armour piercing, and then there was the phosphorus, which was incendiary, and the anti-personnel. I never fired any anti-personnel ones, but they had a peculiar little propeller on the front, and when they were fired the propeller unscrewed and a long rod shot out, so that the explosion took place before the actual warhead was buried in the ground, so that it spread lethal bits in all directions. As I say, mainly I used the 60-pound RP high explosive heads. The anti-personnel one, the armour-piercing one, was used mainly for very heavily fortified gun positions or for shipping, where you could make holes in the hull of the ship underwater, whereas if you used the high explosive they would explode on hitting the water and not make a hole in the ship. One odd thing I noticed in Holland, when we were at Gills Ryan, we had quite a lot of young children helping the armourers. They were young boys between the ages of 10 and 14, and they spent their time slotting the fins into the backs of the rocket motors, which was quite a simple operation. They just put on the right position and then pushed in position. The warheads were mounted by the armourers, but the young kids had a wonderful time just adding the fins to the rockets. With the rockets you could aim them using the gun sight, which was then rotated through 90 degrees so that the 2 horizontal bars became vertical, and you used the top of the bottom vertical bar as the sighting point of your rockets. You set the range width for the angle of dive. If you were flying no angle of dive, a low level attack, you adjusted it so that the top of the vertical bar was lower down, which meant you raised the nose of the aircraft slightly, and the rockets were then fired up at a slight angle and ballistically dropped down at the right position. Later on it was found that the 4-foot rails that were mounted under the wings, and which caused an enormous amount of drag and slowed the aircraft down by at least 50 miles an hour, were not necessarily at all. They found that the rockets were just as accurate if they were hung on little hooks, and when they were fired they just flew off the hooks. They were held in position by a small strand of copper wire which, when you fired the rocket, was sheared as the rocket took off. The rocket motor burnt for only about 3 or 4 seconds, but in that time the acceleration was so violent that by the time the rocket burnt out, the rocket was doing well over 1,000 miles an hour. I found I was quite good at aiming rockets, both at low level and at 30 and 60 degree dives, and I could more or less hit a target the size of a tank more or less every time. I was absolutely no good with my cannon. I was no good at deflection shooting, but with the rockets I could pretty well be sure of hitting what I was aiming at. I think that's more or less all there is to do about rockets.
There is some footage of, some famous footage of rockets being fired at a train, and that could be your plane, couldn't it?
Sorry?
There is some footage of rockets being fired at a train, and that could be your plane, couldn't it?
Rockets being fired?
At a train.
At a train? Yes, we did this. We attacked, at one time we attacked the marshalling yards, I can't remember where, somewhere in northern Germany, towards the end of the war, and we fired the rockets at trains, at railway engines, and also at the tracks at the points to disrupt the marshalling yard, and it was quite successful at that. I found that the best targets were things like bridges, gun emplacements and tanks, things like lorries and small transport like cars. It was a bit of a wasted effort to fire rockets at those, because if you hit it with a pair of rockets they were destroyed, and normally you fired 8 rockets at once, so you were wasting a lot of ammunition. Right.
Thank you.